Dmitri Shostakovich wrote his magnificent first cello concerto in 1959. Now, this was a relatively stable period, even a relatively happy period in his roller coaster career. Shostakovich went from being, well, I don't think many composers have had the experience of being stellar hero and plunging to less than zero in the space of just a split second, it sometimes seems, like Shostakovich. 1 minute he's being feted in the 1930s. His opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk is being played continuously for 2 years in Moscow. It's played all over the world. It's a huge success. Then suddenly an editorial appears in the state newspaper Pravda denouncing it in the most vicious terms and ending with the phrase, "Things might end very badly." You know, I've had some bad reviews in my time, but never anything quite as bad as that. And the same thing happened to Shostakovich again in the 40s, when after having been a huge hero during the war for his amazing morale-boosting Leningrad Symphony, he's suddenly torn to shreds for having failed to produce the necessary hymn to Stalin after the end of victory, and pronounced an enemy of the people, and his music isn't played. Well, Stalin died in 1953, and things got a lot better for Shostakovich after that, as they did for many, many people living in the Soviet Union. It was still a dictatorship, it was still a totalitarian regime, but it was more liberal and outgoing and more tolerant, certainly, than Stalin's regime had been. How does this impact on the cello concerto? Well, in some ways. I mean, I think you can make too much, certainly, of the political dimension of Shostakovich. His music goes on speaking to us now, not because it's talking about his own times, but because it's talking about things that people have to struggle with all the time. I'm very struck looking, for instance, on YouTube for reactions to his Eighth String Quartet, a very tragic piece. Reactions from all over the world, how people respond to it from their own particular predicaments. A woman in Venezuela, for instance, saying that she feels it's as though Shostakovich is speaking to her now about what they're going through. Or another woman in America, after what sounds horribly like a high school shooting, saying that quite a few of them found consolation in the performance of Shostakovich's Eighth Quartet, which I know is something Shostakovich himself would have been thrilled to hear. But there's one little private joke I want to draw your attention to in this concerto, which I think is highly revealing. Shostakovich does love to put private jokes in his works, and you don't need to know them. The music absolutely speaks for itself, but they can add a little bit to your enjoyment. There are 4 movements, the third of which is a long movement for the cello alone. It's like a cadenza in a typical concerto, only it's so big and exploratory, Shostakovich designated it as a movement in its own right. It builds up gradually, and then the finale breaks out with a kind of raucous Russian dance tune. Now, we've hardly got into this before something interesting happens. A little figure is passed between the strings and the high woodwind, like this. Now then, apparently when the cellist Mstislav Rostropovich was rehearsing the first performance with Shostakovich, Shostakovich suddenly pointed at him and smiled his enigmatic little smile and said, "Do you recognize that?" Rostropovich said, "No." And then Shostakovich tittered and sang some words. "Are you in the ground, Suliko?" Well, Suliko was a Georgian folk song, and it was apparently Stalin's favourite song. He himself came from Georgia, not from Russia, Stalin. And he used to sing it from time to time. He used to love to put it on. And the words at this point, this young woman is wondering where her lover is, who's gone far away, and she's singing, "Are you alive or are you in the ground, Suliko?" And this is the point where Shostakovich asks, "Are you in the ground then?" It's Shostakovich, as it were, saying to Stalin, "I'm still alive. What about you then?" Shostakovich's music is rarely uncomplicatedly triumphant. There's always an extraordinarily ambiguous quality to some of his seemingly upbeat endings, but I do feel a kind of quality about the end of this concerto, having gone through quite an extraordinary emotional range on the way, which reminds me of, well, of the Elton John song, "I'm Still Standing." I think, in a way, we can allow Shostakovich that moment of exaltation at the end of this concerto. It's also a brilliant display piece and a tribute to the extraordinary skills of his friend Mstislav Rostropovich. For those of you who do know the cello or can play the cello, I'll tell you that towards the end, the cello part is actually written out on two staves, two sets of lines, like a piano part, because there is just so much going on that it's actually easier to read if it's written out like that. Shostakovich knew that Rostropovich was one of the greatest, apart from being an incredible soul of the cellist. He was also one of the greatest technical exponents of the cello, with an astonishing strength and stamina as well as agility. All of that, I think you can hear display in the final moments of this remarkable concerto. Now, it's always a bit of a question with Shostakovich's pieces. How much does he want you to know before you hear the music? Well, in a way, you don't need to know anything. As I said, I heard the Fifth Symphony for the first time when I was 14, and I was just bowled over by it. It's enriched my understanding greatly to get to know more about why and how it was written. But at the same time, it's a piece of music that speaks on its own terms. But Berlioz's Fantastic Symphony is quite another thing. Right from the start, Berlioz envisaged this as a symphony that would tell a story. It's almost like an opera on the orchestral stage. In fact, he wrote out elaborate and detailed program notes for some of the first performances, which tell in great detail about what's going on. What is the story behind the 5 movements in this incredible symphony? Well, apparently what we are hearing is a story of a young man who has been filled with intense love. Berlioz was a kind of man who couldn't feel anything other than intensely. Everything about Berlioz was intense. And he had himself fallen disastrously in love at the time that he wrote this symphony. And this symphony is about a young man who's fallen disastrously in love. In an attempt to kill himself, he's taken an overdose of opium. But instead of killing him, the opium produces a series of fantastic dreams, and that is what the symphony is about. In the first movement, we see him filled with his longing, his desperate longing for the beloved. And he introduces her in the form of a theme he called the idée fixe, the fixed idea. It's announced, first of all, by the violins and the flutes, like this. And so on. It's a particularly beautiful theme. And that theme goes through a series of adventures. It returns in all 5 of the movements, except each time it does so, it's transformed. And Berlioz has hit on something really quite extraordinary here, that if you want to make music without words telling a story, then something that seems dry and academic, like the development of themes, can actually become a really important way of telling that story. It's a bit like watching the development of a character in a film or a play, or indeed reading about it in a novel. Change is the essence of narrative. And we see characters change, don't we, in novels? And that is exactly what Berlioz is doing here. He's creating a kind of novel in music. We see the whole thing. The second movement is a ball scene, a fabulous, lavish ball in which the young man sees the beloved in the distance and is filled with longing for her, and yet at the end she disappears. The third movement is his loneliness in the country. He's out, but all he can think of is this extraordinary beloved. And at the end of the movement, we hear a cor anglais, like a shepherd piping, only instead of being answered by another shepherd on the oboe, as at the beginning of the movement, the cor anglais is answered by distant timpani rolls, suggesting thunder. It's an incredibly poignant image. And then, as so often in dreams, the image shifts. You know how in dreams one thing can kind of mutate into another? Well, in the fourth movement, those drums become the drums accompanying a march to the scaffold. The young man dreams that he's killed his beloved and he's to be executed. At the end of the movement, there's a particularly garish moment when he has almost, as it were, sees her face in the crowd mocking him on a clarinet. And then there's a huge chord of, as you can imagine, the guillotine dropping and cutting the hero's head off. Finally comes the most extraordinary movement of all, the dream of a witch's Sabbath, in which he's already dead, but he's there in the graveyard in his own coffin, looking at a witch's Sabbath that has gathered to, as it were, commemorate his ending. And suddenly the guest of honor turns up, and it's his beloved, only she's now transfigured into a hideous witch. And the extraordinary moment in the finale where this happens, where Berlioz gives what was once such a beautiful theme to the very high, shrill clarinet with gurgling bassoons and whooping other woodwind in the background. It's an incredible moment where you just sense that this transformation of what was a beautiful image into something horrendous has been actualized in the music. Well, when the symphony was first performed, Berlioz managed to invite the young woman who'd been the object of his attentions and had spurned him, Harriet Smithson, an Irish actress who'd so impressed Berlioz, to the performance. She was, well, quite captivated by the idea that this young man had written this astonishing symphony all about her. And eventually they got together and they married. And I'd love to say it was a success, but unfortunately it wasn't. It was an absolute catastrophe. Well, there you go. I think the story that the symphony tells, which in a way sounds rather like this young man working this passion out of his system, is possibly a more admirable one in a way. We all have to go through a kind of period where we end up reacting against the person we once loved in order to get them out of our system, don't we? That often happens, and you can hear that happening, certainly in The Witch's Sabbath. But the other side of this symphony is that Berlioz was an absolute magician of the orchestra all the way through, and it gets more and more so as we go through. We hear him using the orchestra to evoke colours, images, symbols, in a way that nobody had done in music before. And finally, in the last moment, one of my favourite moments, where you actually get an imitation of church bells, and two tubas blare out the old plain song Dies Irae, associated with the Day of Judgment and with the Requiem. Like that. It's an incredible thrilling moment. And then at the end, as you imagine the witches taking to their broomsticks and riding through the sky, Berlioz actually asks the violins to turn their bows round and tap their strings with the wood of the bows. It's an effect called con legno. Lots of composers have imitated it since, but I think that Berlioz's is probably the most extraordinary use of this device, and it's still quite chilling when it happens. So here is an amazing, vivid, technicolor use of the orchestra to tell an astonishingly vivid story. And in the end, if you hear different things in this music, if you don't exactly follow Berlioz's story, I wouldn't give yourself a hard time, because after all, music is about the imagination. There is creative listening is far better than passive listening. And this music is there to suggest dreams to you. And if those take you in a different way, then of course, by all means, go with them. But it is fascinating to know in Berlioz's case what it was that was on his mind. This, if any composer could have been described as larger than life, I think it's Hector Berlioz. And if any symphony could be described as a reflection of a larger than life character, I think it's the Symphonie Fantastique.